Hello, this is Lecture 1-3, The Northern Successors of Rome, from the Introduction to Medieval Studies at Marlboro College. Last time we talked a bit about Byzantium, which is the true successor of Rome, if you will. Certainly they saw it that way, as well as about the rise of Islam. Now, we're going to go back and look at the development of some barbarian kingdoms, some of the people who looked directly to Rome for their institutions and their view of themselves, as well as the responses of these Germanic kingdoms to the Islamic expansion. We will look at three different states in particular, although focusing mostly on one of them, or at least for longer. I will start with a bit about the Visigoths, and then some with regards to England, and finally we will end with Charlemagne's empire and the rise of the Frankish kingdom, which will also include a discussion of the ways in which the Frankish kingdom formed some of the foundation myths of modern Europe and contemporary historical thinking. So, just to remind ourselves, last time we talked about Justinian's interest in Italy, in particular his attempts to expand Byzantine power into much of the Italian peninsula. He fought largely against the Ostrogoths, but he failed basically with the appearance of the Lombards, who took much of northern Italy and eventually Rome itself. They laid siege to Ravenna, which was one of the imperial powers in Italy. The Lombards will be important today because they are to some extent the foil, well, one of a couple of foils that creates the Carolingian kingdom, which we will return to in a minute. But what is important is that this is Byzantium's last gasp of actual political control in the West. After this point, 7th, 8th century, while kings might still look to the Eastern emperor as a model, especially as we mentioned last time, and even for legitimization, this happens less and less. In our narrative today, we will get to a point where basically it ceases to happen at all. Now, one of the key players, and we'll talk about this guy throughout today and in future lectures, he keeps coming up, is Gregory the Great. In 600, he's the Pope in Rome, and at this point the Lombards have already appeared south of the Alps and are beginning their invasion of the peninsula. He actually sends messengers to Byzantium, Constantinople, to request military aid against the Lombards when they appear, but Constantinople is unable or unwilling perhaps to provide it. So Gregory is shaped by his experience with his request for aid and its failure. His experience with the Lombards, who initially are not friendly to him at all, as well as his sense of what it means to be Pope in Rome without the power of imperial Rome around him. So he's shaped by these concomitant geopolitical experiences. These major aspects begin to shape his policy as well, and we'll return to this, especially when we talk about religion in future lectures, but it's worth knowing who he is at this point. We'll talk a little bit more about him in just a second, but first I want to go back over a little bit about the Visigothic kingdom. Now, if you remember, the Visigothic kingdom held most of Spain and much of southern France throughout this period. They first appeared a couple of centuries ago, along with many of the Germanic groups moving south in the 4th and 5th centuries. But they have a very strong, very sustained kingdom centered on Toledo, and really in shape, in its form, the territory that it possesses, by 600. For a while, they were centered in Toulouse, which is further north, but that's fairly early on and not as long-lived as Toledo. The Visigothic kingdom very much sees itself as one of these successors of Rome. While they disappear in the wake of the Carolingian Empire, and particularly the Islamic takeover of Spain, their institutions and their memory, the fact of their existence and what they mean for later kingship does not. They hold a number of synods with bishops from around the peninsula and even further north, when they attempt to consolidate the church in its Catholic form. They begin as Arians. And I know the Catholic Arian division is probably fuzzy at this point if you're just going through the lectures, but we'll come back, we'll talk about it when we do the religion section. But needless to say, Arian is a form of Christian, but that Catholics considered heretics. And many of the early barbarian kingdoms converted to Arianism before they converted to Catholicism. So we'll come back to that. But suffice to say, the Visigoths are one of these groups that first convert to Arianism and then eventually to Catholicism. And after their conversion to Catholicism, they hold these synods, which is a big meeting of bishops in which they consolidate Catholic doctrine and make sure that everybody is on the same page. Part of that has to do with bureaucratic centralization of the state, making sure that everyone believes the same tenets of the religion. They also consolidate and write down a whole bunch of Roman laws. And this is really important for structures of power and rulership. The Visigothic Code, as it is perhaps obviously called, borrows largely from earlier Roman law and looks something like a Visigothic version of the Justinianic law corpus, although it is not as thorough as Justinian's reform, and it doesn't have as many new laws. It's a little more of a compilation of previous Roman practices, but like what Justinian does, they're going back, they're selecting out the best law and creating this new corpus that is meant to stand as the general law of the kingdom. While their actual structural power disappears by 800. In particular, they're overrun when the Muslims invade the Iberian Peninsula in 711. The capital at Toledo is taken, and most of the structure of the kingdom falls apart shortly thereafterwards. The Visigoths still get used as the legendary foundation of much of Spanish identity in later centuries. While 19th century historians lionize the Frankish kingdom as the beginning of the French and even the German nation, Spanish historians did similar work identifying contemporary Catholic Spain as a direct descendant of this Visigothic kingdom, both in their Catholicism, in their foundational use of Roman laws, their conception of rights. Even in the later Middle Ages, Spanish kingdoms would go back and use the Visigothic code as part of newer legal formulations. They still used many of the synods that were convened. The synods were already considered canonical for what the Spanish church looked like and what their doctrine should say. So much so that by 1500, when Spain is a major power and begins taking over parts of the Americas, they still consider themselves to have this legendary Visigothic past. They imagine that as the origin of Spanish kingship. Now, the Visigothic identity is what fueled Spanish rhetoric that what they were doing was a reconquest of the peninsula from Muslim rulership rather than simply a conquest of a neighboring state, right? The borders of states go back and forth all the time, and usually it's referred to simply as a conquest. When the Anglo Saxons invade England or when Charlemagne takes over Saxony, we refer to it as a conquest of a neighboring state. But the rhetoric of the reconquest from the Muslims was based on the claim, no, we are descendant directly from Visigothic kings and Visigothic people. Therefore, this whole peninsula used to be ours and should be ours in the future. And that becomes the rhetorical claim of the nobility retaking the peninsula in the 13th and 14th century. So rhetorically, this is a very important kingdom, particularly as one of the early examples of an ostensibly barbarian people combining both Catholic Christianity, strong central government, and Roman legal tradition to create a new legitimate barbarian state. Okay. The next kingdom that we'll look at least briefly, and I'm going to spend the most time with the Carolingians at the end, but the next kingdom is England. Now, if you remember, England was Roman very, very early on. This is also the case for other places that we're talking about, right? The Visigothic kingdom in Spain and in southern France, it isn't 100% under Roman control, but most areas are completely Romanized, and the people there speak Latin and consider themselves Roman by these later centuries. Like Spain, like areas of Spain and France, England also has Roman influence from very early on. Also, we're not talking about the whole of the UK or even all of the islands. This does not include Scotland or Ireland. Scotland especially continued resisting the Romans for centuries, right? Hadrian's Wall is famous for exactly that reason. England is first invaded by Julius Caesar himself, but that invasion doesn't really go anywhere. Julius Caesar shows up, he fights some battles, some of the locals fight, some of them run away. Julius Caesar eventually packs up and leaves, and it's almost 40 or 50 years later that any Romans actually come to set up cities and towns, build roads, create administrative systems that make for a more permanent presence. And as a side note about those roads, they build sort of comically straight roads. I mentioned earlier the strong gender assumptions in the state of Rome, especially fighting against female barbarian rulers. This is especially true in England, where one of the most famous people who resists Rome for a very long time is the English queen named Baetica. One modern writer has a very colorful passage of Rome being so dedicated to the idea of masculine straight roads conquering a feminine nature that their roads just go up and over impossible terrain. They brook no compromise whatsoever with the natural world. If there's a stream that bends to the left here and there's a cliff, they're just going to go straight up over the cliff, straight down over the stream, and keep going forward. Even this modern commentator refers to this as a hyper-masculine Roman outlook that you can see even in their road building. Needless to say, from very early on, by around 100, there's a lot of Roman influence in Britain. There are cities, there is Roman administration, Roman legal traditions, and the Britons begin to refer to themselves as Roman. And I mentioned in the first lecture that there was even a Roman senator who escapes to England in the turmoil of the rising barbarian kingdoms and says, no, I'm the Roman emperor, but now the Roman Empire is in England. Now the Britons maintain themselves and consider themselves Roman. They're Catholic from a fairly early date, but England itself has wave after wave of different barbarian invaders, and in many ways, more than we see on the continent, or at least more consistently. The most famous of these is probably the Anglo Saxons. Now, we don't know exactly who the Anglo Saxons are. One of the most famous narrators of this time period, the Venerable Bede, refers to 3 tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And we think that they came from the coastline around Denmark, southern Sweden, and Norway. Arguments that are made about what these groups actually were are often guided by contemporary ideas of race. Thomas Jefferson, for example, himself thought that the Anglo-Saxons were direct descendants and ideological predecessors of the American colonies, of the modern British people, and by extension, the settlers in the United States. He actually writes, quote, "To remind him, the King of England, that our ancestors, before their emigration to America, were the free inhabitants of the British dominion in Europe, and possessed a right which nature has given to all men of departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, of going in quest of new habitations, and of there establishing new societies under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness, that their Saxon ancestors had under this universal law in like manner left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, had possessed themselves of the Isle of Britain, then less charged with inhabitants, and had established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country." So Jefferson's pretty sure he knows who the Anglo-Saxons are, and he's also pretty sure that American patriotism and love of freedom is a direct descendant of this Anglo-Saxon culture. Never mind the Norman invasion in 1066, he considered that a mere French overlay, and that the Anglo-Saxon culture persisted undisturbed for several more centuries until it had a chance to more fully express itself in the colonies. That's not how we see the Norman invasion. That's getting ahead of ourselves. It's a different lecture. Suffice to say, this particular view of the Anglo-Saxons underpinned Jefferson's ideas about race as well, that only Anglo-Saxon people, certainly not African slaves, Native Americans, not even really French or other Europeans, could truly appreciate freedom and the right to property. Jefferson even believed that Anglo-Saxon common law contained no Christianity, and never did. But that's getting too far afield. The locating of contemporary English and American identity and even political ideology in these legendary recesses of the past continues today. A Forbes magazine commentary a couple of years ago attempted to claim how much the, quote, Anglo-Saxon tradition meant for limited government, kings who could not rule their people because of common law. And it is true that the groups that came from Scandinavia and invaded England at this time did not use Roman law and had certain sets of customs, and we'll come back to this in a minute. But the author of this commentary translates this idea to argue that less government intervention and less government regulation is the fundamental tradition not just of the United States, but that this goes back to this legendary invasion of England. As is probably obvious, this is a fairly dubious history, and much of English legal tradition still owes its framework to Roman ideas and not entirely to northern tribal ideas, or at least to a mix of the two, as all of the other barbarian tribes do. The writer even admits that the historicity is, quote, murky, and that most modern historians dismiss this as mere lore. And yeah, pretty much we do. The Jutes have been entirely erased in this narrative, and the truth is that we don't know that much about the 3 northern groups, what set them apart. We do know some features about how their society was organized, and it is different in some ways than Rome. And as I mentioned, this customary law is one of those. But their cultural identity and their cultural systems certainly do not make it intact across another 1,000 years of history. Much of our knowledge about these groups expands when they begin writing in response to Roman bureaucratic systems. They see Roman bureaucracy and systems of writing and begin to write down some of their own practices, but already in the practice of writing, it is mixed with Roman attitudes. They write down new law codes, not unlike other northern groups, encountering and imitating Rome. They are distinct in that they write down their legal system in their native tongue rather than in Latin, the language that we still call Anglo-Saxon, the language that Beowulf is written in and other texts. However, these historical facts have not prevented the argument from continuing to exist that Anglo-Saxon culture forms some sort of fundamental basis of English, and by extension American, free market and constitutional democratic ideas. Needless to say, sometime in between the 6th and 7th century, waves of northern groups, barbarians, Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, appeared in England. They took over large amounts of territory from the Romanized and largely Catholic Britons. The groups were non-Christian, they don't speak Latin, they don't have a lot of interest in speaking Latin, and if anything, they are further removed from the idea of imperial Rome than the Britons who are already there. Even their legal system, as I noted above, they have a less centralized state. Even when they opt to write down their laws in imitation of Rome, they leave a stronger role for custom or traditional rights. Their kings have less centralized power and are more constrained by traditional powers held by other elites in the group, and the king is largely there to uphold rights that other people have already assented to. As we will talk about in the future, part of this was a lack of Christian identification and the justification of central power of the king that often came with Christianity. But part of this was a general northern reliance on councils and consent to new laws rather than kings being able to simply mandate changes. The strongest form of this type of system, at least that we have evidence for, appears in Iceland, where whole groups were governed by an elite council called the All-Thing. Maintenance of traditional law, even major conflict resolution, came through the voting council, even ultimately the decision to convert to Christianity. It's a very different way of holding power. It's quite fascinating. Feel free to look it up, read more about it if you're interested. But for now, suffice to say, it appears to have been more common amongst many of these northern groups, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and some version of this more tribal system comes to England with the invaders and is then loosely combined with Roman ideas of law and cements itself as the major type of government for a few hundred years, in one form or another at least until the Norman invasion in 1066. Although along the way there are other alliances with other Danes, there's another brief Danish invasion, there are some Viking invasions, but by and large the system persists until the Normans arrive in 1066. As another side note about things you can read more about, if anybody wants a primary source, there's actually a fabulous text, sometimes referred to as The Groaning of the Britons, written by the monk named Gildas, who talks about all of the horrible things that the Angles and Saxons do to the Britons when they show up. He is definitely not a fan of the invasion. At any rate, one of the most famous cultural results of this invasion is here on this slide, from one of the most famous sites of Anglo-Saxon archaeology. These are from the funeral ship and the various burial grounds found at a place called Sutton Hoo, a place that was a burial site actually for a very, very long time, a couple of centuries at least, and there are Christian burials there from later times. It has a lot to say about shifts in English history along its northern coast, but needless to say, this funeral ship is entirely Anglo-Saxon, and you can see, to some extent, from the helmet, which doesn't look Roman, but particularly from the brooch and the enameled jewelry on the right. This looks more like Celtic knotwork. There are no Christian images of any sort. We don't really know exactly what these animals are, although they look bird-ish based on the wing patterns that you can see. This is the sort of thing that one finds at Sutton Hoo in the burial of what was probably an Anglo-Saxon chieftain. So this is at least the visual culture that we see beginning to rule England and producing two levels of English society, where the Britons, who still think of themselves as owing something to Rome and being Catholic, and this new invading group, which really are the political rulers of England and will remain so until 1066. However, along the way, the Anglo-Saxons do adopt more Roman customs, and they begin to adopt a more centralized state, and as I mentioned, they adopt written language. But where they get those ideas is not a conscious imitation of Rome, as some of the other barbarians, or rather not from the Imperium, it does happen to come from the city of Rome, but it actually comes from a direct project of the Pope that I mentioned earlier, Pope Gregory, who meets a group of Englishmen in Rome, and they're probably slaves when he meets them. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to their conversion, because it's a religious narrative and it's kind of a colorful story. So look out for the colorful story in a future lecture. At any rate, in 600, Gregory the Great sends Augustine of Canterbury, and he's called Augustine of Canterbury because he dies in a monastery in Canterbury that he founds in England. Again, we'll get to that. But he sends Augustine to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Catholicism. And one of the things that Augustine brings with him is the idea of a centralized state. He's offering a more powerful kingship with the imprimatur of God and the Pope, the blessing of them that they have legitimacy and can actually rule a larger state. That's one of the political offerings that Augustine uses to convert, particularly the rulers of Northumbria. When we talk about the conversion of Christianity, we'll talk about the utility of the Catholic image for centralizing statehood, particularly in these barbarian kingdoms further. For the moment, Augustine brings the idea of, again, written culture along with him, but also Roman bureaucratic culture and ways of having kingship that look more Roman and more centralized. And when the Anglo-Saxons do convert, they join the polity of European Catholic states, if you will. They look more to Rome, but particularly to the Pope, not just for religious leadership, but political leadership and political ideas. And as I mentioned last time, this is a major shift. And the Pope that they're looking to is not just any Pope. This is Gregory, who earlier himself had looked to Constantinople for political and military support against the Lombards, but it was not given. So this Pope is now deciding that political and military support has to be local, or at least has to be something that he himself controls. So he's reaching out to different groups in the West, the Anglo-Saxons in this instance, to begin creating states around him that have more allegiance and will be more assistance to him than more distant Constantinople. Now, this makes the Pope a political figure and potentially a military figure, although obviously the Pope can't really, or at least usually doesn't, command armies. I'm not saying it never happens, but that's not Gregory's method at this point. Now, here on the right is a page from the document that I mentioned earlier, the Venerable Bede. Now, as you can see in the text of the history, the knotwork in the letters and the script writing is a particularly English style. It owes something to the visual culture that produces something like Sutton Hoo. But this is also a text called the Historia Anglorum. The full title is The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. So this is written by a monk. Some of the visual culture of the Anglo-Saxons continues in its Christianized form. And the way of writing is actually referred to as insular text. It's a particular visual style associated with newly converted and Catholic groups, particularly in Northumbria, as I mentioned before. That's the largest of these kingdoms. There are 4 or 5 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. All of them produce this knotwork-oriented and really quite beautiful writing systems. One of the most famous is the Lindisfarne Gospels, if you want to look that up. That is a great example of this sort of thing. In Bede's history, he details much of the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons, all the way up to the conversion of their leaders and the creation of a centralized state. And he's very much concerned in particular with the kings of Northumbria, the largest of the tribal groups, largely because he believes this centralized state advances the cause of the Catholic Church. And he's writing around 700, late 7th, early 8th century. Most importantly, he's writing a history in which Imperial Rome and Constantinople do not play a large part. Constantinople is quite distant. The power and legitimacy of this kingdom comes from the Pope. And this is an important character of these successor states of Rome. Okay. Now we're going to turn to the Franks, and we're going to spend the most time with the Franks today, partly because they become, as you might have noticed in the first map, the largest kingdom by a long shot, but also to a large extent they become the most valorized, the most imitated, and the most legendary in later histories, both medieval histories and modern. They become the foundation of European political unity, and they're often claimed, as the Anglo-Saxons were for England, and to some extent the Visigoths for Spain. The Franks become a similar basis for many other groups, particularly France and Germany, but all sorts of ideas about what European culture should be. So this is a map in 600. I've cut it off a little bit, but you can see the orange down here is still the Visigothic kingdom. You've noticed that they've lost a little bit of southern France to the counties of Aquitaine and the kingdom of Burgundy. And here in the center of France, Austrasia, which I mentioned last time, and all of these are Frankish kingdoms. They're multiple Frankish kingdoms. Burgundy, Neustria, Austrasia, they're all descendants of the Franks, roughly from the same northern group. Some of them are ruled by people who are probably distant cousins, but they're not consolidated. They don't have a single strong kingdom in any fashion. You can also see on this map the crumbling of Italy. The Byzantine exarchate still exists, but they only have a little bit of control of little pieces of Italy, and that comes and goes depending on what the Lombards are doing at the time. There are a couple of strong duchies. The Duchy of Spoleto in particular is an important political center, but again, the extent of their power is subject to the decisions and invasions of the Lombards. Before we actually talk about that invasion, there are some key changes that happen in the Frankish system of government. These changes have some precedence in the British Isles, and you will see echoes of what happens with the Anglo-Saxons, but the results are far more systemic. The first of these changes is this turn to Rome that I describe as Gregory converts the Anglo-Saxon groups. The Franks also, instead of turning to Constantinople, instead of trying to justify themselves as a petty king who has been offered that kingdom by the imperial ruler of Rome, they also begin to turn to the Pope for legitimacy. One of the other changes is their relationship to surrounding powers. This includes Islam, but also other European groups, especially the Lombards. The Franks become, as they consolidate, they become very expansionist. This is 600, right, on the map? This is 700. You'll notice the Frankish kingdom is already beginning to consolidate itself into a single unit. This is a long process. In 511, I mentioned the king Clovis back in the first lecture. Clovis begins unifying the Central European region under the Franks, but he dies in 511 without having been really all that successful. But it sets a precedent and even a goal for later kings and leaders. But it's not until the Carolingians over 2 centuries later that they really consolidate both a lot of power and a huge amount of land. And that's some of what we're seeing here in this map, that the Frankish kingdom will continue to grow to become the dominant power for all of Central and Western Europe, even before the Carolingians, although it reaches its climax with the Carolingians. Just to be clear, Carolingians are called that because of their most famous king, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, but Clovis himself is a Merovingian. They are the Frankish group that holds power prior to the Carolingians. Clovis is part of this extended family of Merovingians, and much of Merovingian power was predicated on maintaining control through a family hierarchy that differed in several important respects from Roman tradition. Most notably, Roman practice encouraged primogeniture. The firstborn son inherits all the land and all the power and control and the rights and titles of their father. Roman law also had relatively little use for daughters, who often acted as no more than gifts from the father to that could be doled out from the father to the father's friends. Merovingian kingship, on the other hand, practiced partible inheritance. They would divide up, often whole kingdoms, between multiple sons. So a centralized Frankish kingdom is always fighting against this centripetal force that if you have one strong ruler with 3 sons, it's going to become 3 kingdoms. And we'll see this really forcefully with the end of the Carolingians. But additionally, daughters were routinely used as power brokers, not just through marriage politics, which is probably fairly well known, right? You marry a daughter to somebody who is kind of an enemy and kind of a friend, and by doing so, you hope to make them more closely aligned with your family. But they also act as familial support through the church. The Merovingian rulers routinely placed their daughters in important monastic houses. They would make them abbesses and leaders of church institutions that controlled land in order to gain familial control over new areas and important political posts. The Carolingians are not from the Merovingian family, and their power center is actually a little further north along the Rhine near Cologne. But they exist already enmeshed in this system of reward and obligation and familial connection. They begin actually as dukes. And if you remember this term, dukes in Latin, they are military leaders for the Merovingian family. They're favored by the Merovingian kings themselves, and they often lead Merovingian armies. Their title is actually mayor. It's a general leader. So they're the mayor of the palace, is how they're usually referred to. It's a hereditary title, and they control much of what happens in the kingdom from this position. And in particular, not surprisingly, they control the military. This becomes a key component of their use of papal support. So Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, lives from 676 to 741 and really consolidates his position as mayor of the palace. He's an adept military leader. He's also quite ambitious. In some ways, he begins to actually run the country for the Merovingians. Charles Martel wins a series of battles on their behalf, one of which would become very important to later historians, the Battle of Tours in 732, against a group of raiders from Spain under the command of the North African Abd al-Rahman, who at the time was the governor of Al-Andalus in Spain. But I'll come back to that in a second. More notably, during his time as mayor of the palace, there are several other Frankish nobles from Neustria, one of the kingdoms that I mentioned above, that rebel against the Merovingians, and in particular against Charles's own increasing influence and wealth. In the ensuing, basically, civil war, right? These are different Frankish tribes fighting each other. Despite some setbacks, Charles eventually emerges entirely victorious, adding to both his own control and his prestige, as well as the further consolidation of land and power in the Frankish kingdoms under a single ruler. Most notably for their relationship with the Pope is not Charles Martel, but rather his son Pepin using this military weight against the Lombards. Now, as I mentioned, the Lombards in the 7th and 8th century are really consolidating their power over Italy. Northern Italy is still referred to as Lombardy to this day, so the area is run by the Lombard king. Initially, like the Visigoths, the Lombards are Arian Christians, not Catholic, and as such they have no interest in relationship with the Pope. But in 712, they convert to Catholicism under a king named Liutprand. But once Liutprand has succeeded in removing Byzantine influence from Rome, the Byzantines still have a small foothold in Ravenna, but the exarchate has basically been completely taken over by the Lombards. He turns his attention to taking over these large duchies, the Duchy of Spoleto, and eventually controlling the politics of Rome itself. When this happens, of course, this is after Gregory the Great has died, but the popes still remember the previous attempts of earlier popes to go to Constantinople and ask for help, and having that be unsuccessful. So when the Lombards appear in the early 8th century, the Pope at the time decides Constantinople is probably not going to be that much help, and they turn elsewhere. So in 751, then Pope Zachary makes a deal with Charles Martel's son Pepin, and this deal is really the foundation of later Carolingian power, and it's also why it's referred to as the Holy Roman Empire. This is also the foundation of later debates about secular or religious kingship and the importance of the religious acknowledgement of someone to be king. Debates that get held about how power is divvied up in Europe for centuries. And the deal is this, and this is key. Zachary, who has decided not to go to Constantinople, they're too far away, they're too ineffective, they're not going to help, turns to Pepin and says, I need military help against the Lombards. And Pepin says, okay, fine, I can help. I've got a bunch of horses, they're really good at fighting, but there's a problem. I'm not the king. I would like to help, but I would also like to be king. So Zachary proclaims that those with actual power should be those that are in power, claiming that, okay, Pepin, as the mayor of the palace, has actual political and military control over the kingdom, therefore he should be the one who is named in power. So he offers coronation in exchange for military aid. And Zachary infuses political sovereignty with papal legitimacy and actually holds a ceremony where he places a crown on Pepin's head after Pepin comes down and subdues the Lombards. They eventually swear fealty to him. He doesn't conquer them outright, and that's what this purple area on the map implies. It's still Lombardy, but they are suzerains. They owe allegiance to Pepin because he has beaten them in battle. And the fact that he doesn't conquer them but allows some autonomy as long as they swear fealty and stop messing with Rome is something that will come back with Charlemagne. So this is a turning point for military rulers in particular because now they're turning to the Pope for their legitimacy. They're not turning to the emperor. But it's also a turning point for the Pope because the Pope is now to some extent the de facto ruler of Rome and able to declare who is king. There's no emperor, the Pope has at least local control, but is beginning to declare a broader control over the rulers of Europe, the right to ordain secular leaders, which, as I mentioned, is something that we saw with Augustine's mission to the Anglo Saxons when he reinforces Anglo-Saxon kingship for the good of the church. Zachary's successor pope, Stephen II, actually travels all the way to France to personally crown Pepin again to renew this promise. Now, to return briefly to the Battle of Tours, this is the battle between Charles Martel and the mixed Arab and Berber army under Abd al-Rahman. It appears frequently in this narrative as a major turning point, not just for the Franks, but for Europe as a whole. This narrative is actually driven more by contemporary ideas of the clash of civilizations between Islam and the West than it is on any primary sources that we have. Islamic groups did appear, as I mentioned, in 711. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. They proceed to conquer the Visigothic kingdom, most of the Iberian Peninsula, and little pieces of territory north of the Pyrenees. However, their presence in central France might have had as much to do with internal Frankish politics and these multiple Frankish kingdoms I mentioned as with any further desire on their part for conquest north. A couple of Frankish sources actually state that the army was invited by the Duke of Aquitaine, Eudo, who's one of these dukes that opposed Charles Martel's strength at court, not unlike the Neustrians. Charles had taken away some of Eudo's land, and in retaliation, this was an attempt by Eudo to retake those lands. However, there's a papal biographer who wants to lionize the Carolingians and how great they are, who portrays it as a massive victory. He says there were over 300,000 people engaged in the battle, tens of thousands of Muslims dead. Of course, given that the entire population of Constantinople at the time was only around 50,000, the number is pretty unlikely. But what is clear is that this is a papal biographer emphasizing the strength of the Carolingians and the importance of the Catholic Church. Muslim chroniclers, on the other hand, hardly mention the event. Now that might be because it's a defeat, but there are famous defeats that chroniclers make a really big deal of, right? You could think of the Crusade battle at the Horns of Hattin, where the Crusaders lose to Saladin. That appears in a lot of Crusader chronicles. So it's not just that the chroniclers wanted to leave out the defeat. It's more likely that they just weren't interested in that event because it wasn't an extension of territory. It wasn't an invasion attempt. There wasn't a strong reason why Abdurrahman was there. He wasn't looking to take over the Franks. Now, while there's not a lot to be known about the event, we do know that later scholarship greatly exaggerates the importance of this single battle. Even in the 13th century, French royal historians cited the battle as a major victory of French kings over Islam. And keep in mind, those historians were as distant from the battle itself as we are from Columbus. In the 19th century, both German and French historians described the battle as a turning point, as does the famous English historian Edward Gibbon. Although in part because of Charles's own origins around Cologne north of the Rhine, which today is more in Germany than in France, German historians often claimed Martel more as their own, and the French would sometimes downplay his importance. Some French historians even describe Martel as more of a German invader, right? Again, echoing 19th and 20th century concerns, not medieval concerns, because of his treatment of other Franks like Eudo and the Neustrians who were in southern France, who he would come and conquer their towns. However, more recent writings in the 20th century and even the 21st often cite Martel and the Carolingians in general as the origin of this perceived clash of civilizations that I mentioned. Conservative commentators today often reference these events specifically. Steve Bannon mentioned the battle as a critical moment in the struggle between Judeo-Christian culture and Islamic culture. There was a French anti-Arab terrorist group in the 1970s who called themselves the Charles Martel Group, right? A perceived historical French European who is fighting with just violence against Islamic invaders. The list goes on. Anyway, I will come back to this briefly at the end after describing Charlemagne himself when we will talk about some of his cultural resonance today and the continued use of this narrative. But for the moment, that's enough about the Battle of Tours. So back to Pepin. Pepin makes this deal with the Pope. He has an increasing legitimacy, he's declared king, he gets a crown, and the Merovingians are summarily deposed. The last king is actually sent off to live in a monastery. And Pepin expands and consolidates military control over the entire kingdom. Now, this brings us to Charlemagne himself, who rules from 771 to 814. And yes, we don't actually know if this image is Charlemagne. We think it might be, could be Charles the Bald, but Charles the Bald is a pretty interesting character too. I'm not going to talk about him today, but you should go look him up. At any rate, when Pepin dies, which is actually in 768, not in 771, he divides his power between his two sons. Carolingians, like the Merovingians, continue practicing partible inheritance and use some of the same family consolidation tactics that the Merovingians used, through marriage, placing daughters in monasteries, etc. Their daughters could even inherit power, although the society remained more patriarchal and thus they did not receive the same inheritance as their sons. To some extent, this causes problems for the Carolingians when they take over the Merovingians. As I noted, the Merovingians would frequently give their daughters control of powerful monastic institutions. They would give them positions of power, but are not the direct sort of male military control over territory. Hence, many of the monastic institutions throughout the Frankish lands are still run by daughters of the older Merovingian houses. These practices also change how wives and political marriages work, and the use of marriage as a form of alliance, which was not commonly practiced in Rome. At any rate, Charlemagne and his brother are co-rulers in 768, two halves of the kingdom, basically. Charlemagne's brother, Carloman, is actually the older son. This is a harbinger of difficulties to come for the Carolingians. That'll be in the next lecture. In this case, it stays solid enough, basically because Carloman dies 3 years later. So in 771, Charlemagne becomes the sole ruler, which works out well for him at least. He consolidates and expands the empire a great deal and is considered a brilliant military leader even at the time. But he also adopts all sorts of Roman models of bureaucracy. He increases education in his realm. He is really keen that all of the nobles become as educated as possible. He wants them all to be literate. In the church, he leads a general effort at unification and consolidation, including making all of the liturgy, the church practice and worship, more consistent through the realm. He brings in teachers both from England and from Italy. One of the most famous is an English monk named Alcuin, who really revamps the educational system and helps with this liturgical consolidation. But in particular, having one very strong leader provides a new image of kingship. And we'll go over that a little bit with the primary source. If you look in the art store folder, you will see a crown from the Ottonians. The Ottonians are one of the successor dynasties to the Carolingians, and we'll talk about in class how that crown looks and what its significance might be, particularly in relation to this story about popes and kings and legitimacy. I mentioned that the division of rule between Carloman and Charlemagne is a bit of a harbinger. Part of the weakness of family politics continues to be evident with the Carolingians. The Carolingians basically managed to narrowly avoid the problems for 3 generations simply by having only one son, who survives long enough to be the ruler. But Charlemagne comes close. Charlemagne's first wife, named Desiderata, and there's some debate about exactly what her name is. That might not be what it is, but we're going to call her Desiderata. She is the daughter of Desiderius, the same Lombard king that Pepin had recently subdued for Pope Zachary. So she herself is a family political choice to attempt to bring closer together the Lombards who Pepin forced to swear fealty with Pepin's son Charles. But this turns out to backfire. Not only does Charlemagne annul the marriage, angering the Lombards, but when Carloman dies, his wife and 2 sons flee to the protection of that same Lombard prince. There's no evidence of their exact intent, but it might be that Carloman's widow wanted to attempt to reclaim the lands of Carloman for her sons, which Charlemagne had claimed as his own in a unified Frankish kingdom, and she wanted perhaps to use Lombard muscle to help. Now, whatever their intent, shortly thereafter, the Lombards do rebel, and Charlemagne is forced to return to Italy to subdue them again. And Charlemagne, like his father, is successful. He beats the Lombard armies and forces their subservience back to the Franks. A side note as I switch images here, this is a bust of Charlemagne, although it comes from much later, right, several centuries later. It's actually meant to be Charlemagne's head. And more than that, it's a reliquary bust, which meant that it was actually meant to contain his skull, which is a pretty intense funerary practice. Anyway, that was a side note. Charlemagne's later wives also all conform to this familial political model. His second wife, Hildegard, is an Alemanni princess. The Alemanni are a tribe closer to central Germany, who Charles Martel had forced into suzerainty earlier in the century. So again, we see expanding the territory through family politics, attempting to strengthen connections in one of the directions that the Carolingians don't have solid control over. It's exactly like the arrangement with the Lombards. A previous military ruler forced them into suzerainty, and one of the princes of the Carolingians marries the daughter of one of those surrounding groups, although in this case, it's more successful than it was with the Lombards. This second wife, Hildegard, dies in childbirth, which is one of the major premature causes of death right up to the 19th century for women. But Charlemagne's third wife, Fastrada, comes from yet another Frankish group that Charles Martel had consolidated under Carolingian control, but whose allegiance was not quite certain. She and Charlemagne have several children before she also dies, and then for Charlemagne's fourth and last wife, he again marries an Alemanni, marrying a woman named Luitgard. Although there are no known children between Luitgard and Charlemagne, he had multiple children with his earlier 2 wives, Fastrada and Hildegard. And he has multiple daughters. And again, similar to Merovingian practice, many of them receive highly placed positions, especially as abbesses in powerful monasteries, in part to continue the efforts to replace Merovingian control of land throughout the kingdom. Now, just by way of contrast, Julius Caesar also had 3 wives, so not 4, but close. And they all come from other senatorial families and direct connections with Caesar's political male friends. They're more like favors between powerful men already in relationship with one another. Now, this echoes the fact that in Roman practice, women are much more seen as property than they are in the northern groups that set up their kingdoms in the Western Empire. Women often maintained more political control of their own, even as they played a subservient role in this familial politics that I'm describing. Now, when we talk about the breakdown of central authority next week, we'll see a little bit more of that in particular situations. There are daughters that actually take full political control, especially of some of the smaller realms. So, back to this deal between Pepin and the Pope. By 772, the Lombards, as I mentioned, have rebelled again after Charlemagne's brother died and he annuls his marriage to the Lombard princess. So Hadrian I, who was Pope at the time, asked for renewed assistance from Charlemagne, who in return asks for a re-acknowledgement of Carolingian rule, the same deal that Pepin had. Hadrian agrees, and Charlemagne returns to defeat the Lombards, and actually this time simply assumes the title of King of the Lombards. Suzerainty is not really enough. He doesn't accept the same fealty offered to his father. The relationship between Charlemagne and the papacy then gets stronger when Hadrian's successor, Leo III, is attacked by partisans, supporters of Hadrian I, who supported a different successor. Leo III flees to Charlemagne, who directly intervenes, offers military assistance, marches back into Rome, and has Leo installed as pope. In response, Leo III ups the papal support. And on Christmas Day in the year 800, a date that really becomes legendary later on, it gets used even in prophetic ways, Charlemagne goes to Rome for Christmas Mass, and during the Mass, Leo places a crown on Charlemagne's head and declares him the new emperor, rather than simply king of the Franks, as Zachary and Stephen had pronounced Pepin. This changes Charlemagne's claim to power, but also flies in the face of the previous relationships with Constantinople. At least ceremonially, the Pope is now claiming to restart the Western Empire, right? And this is what we refer to as the Holy Roman Empire. It's holy because it's sanctioned by the Pope. It has this Catholic standing. So this is a claim that this is the new Western Empire, however much Frankish rule doesn't look like the old Western Empire. Now, by some accounts, this was more of a rhetorical claim by the Pope and not necessarily something that Charlemagne wanted. There are reports of tensions because the Pope thinks that the Pope is granting Charlemagne full political power, but the Pope also humbles him and makes him do things that Charlemagne found unreasonable and thought made him look lesser than the Pope, whereas Charlemagne feels he is the military ruler, he has just helped the Pope. The Pope actually should be subservient to Charlemagne, but the ceremony makes it look the other way around. The ceremony also forcefully proclaims that the Pope has the power to pronounce people king or even emperor, which, again, Charlemagne surely saw that differently, considering that the same Pope had literally just asked Charlemagne to save his butt. Charlemagne is left with sort of a bad taste in his mouth from the whole thing about what the Pope was doing, but he still felt that he needed some sort of legitimation of his rule to actually control all of the land that he controls. While Constantinople was surely unhappy with the statement, they were also in the midst of an iconoclastic movement that opposed the use of all images in Christian worship. The movement became quite violent. There deposed emperors and empresses that causes significant political tension and upheaval. It's called iconoclasm because they begin burning and removing icons, these large paintings from churches. So worrying about the fact that the Pope, who doesn't want to have iconoclasm spread to the West either, is looking for a new center of political power is just not high on their priorities list. Despite the internal tension, there are still envoys sent to Constantinople and back, such as one of the readings by Liutprand of Cremona, which really is a pretty funny primary source to read. Liutprand is not helpful for calming Byzantine-Roman relations in any way. He's completely condescending to the Eastern Emperor. He thinks he's mistreated. He has nothing but bad things to say. You can really see that even if they're making some sort of movement towards normal relations, that political connection is just not going to materialize. And a couple of centuries later, there's a more final split, and there's never an attempt to reunify papal control in the West and imperial control in the East. Back to the map just briefly for one last important expansion to Frankish rule in the 8th century. The two Alemanni princesses that Charlemagne married both come from the area in central Germany. If you look up where the modern countries are, Strasbourg, which is right on the border of modern France and Germany, Frankfurt and Mainz, which are both in Germany itself, are right on the Rhine. Worms, which is another fairly important imperial city, is just south of Frankfurt. So all of what Charlemagne is trying to control by marrying Alemanni princesses is in this southwestern portion of modern Germany. The center of Frankish control, or at least Carolingian descendancy, is really northern France up to part of the edge of the Rhine in Cologne, but also parts of Belgium and further west. Although it's worth noting that the capital that Charlemagne eventually sets up is in the city of Aachen. It's actually not marked on this map, which seems a little odd, but perhaps that's because Charlemagne hasn't set it up yet. But Aachen is currently in Germany, but it's right on the border between Germany and Belgium. And this geographic border is a major reason that both Germany and France consider Charlemagne one of their legendary first kings. He's a Frank, but he lives in Germany, he controls territory from both, and he's claimed as a predecessor by both later German emperors, such as the Ottonians, but also the French kings. All those Louis in the lineage of French kings, 13th, the 14th, the 18th, the Louis that they consider number one is Charlemagne's son. So Charlemagne becomes pretty important for just about every other ruler in later times. But beyond the marriage politics that cement Carolingian control throughout Frankish lands, the two main areas of expansion are into Lombard Italy, which I've already described, and also into northern Saxony, territories which are further into central and northern Germany, which you can see near the top of the map here where it says Saxony. Now, I described how the Battle of Tours between Abd al-Rahman and Charles Martel gets used to describe a clash of civilizations, a cultural conflict founded in religion. But in the 8th century, it's actually the Saxons that really combine the overlapping goals of zealous Christianization, cultural assimilation and military territorial expansion for the Carolingians. Military conflict with the Saxons had been a persistent feature for nearly a century. Saxon raids against the Franks prompted Charles Martel to attack and destroy several Saxon raiding parties along the Weser River in central Germany, which is a little further east from the Rhine. Anytime Pepin brought his military south, either to Italy to subdue the Lombards or to fight with the Dukes of Aquitaine or some of the Muslim kingdoms in Spain. He does conquer Barcelona, but also major towns like Poitiers and Toulouse from the Aquitanians. He risked incursions, more raiding and unrest from the Saxons to the north. Under Charlemagne, the Franks finally sought an end to the raiding using increasingly harsh treatment and extreme violence. Charlemagne attacked or invaded Saxony nearly every year from the beginning of his reign until 804. That's 30 years. In 776, the Saxons said that they would convert to Christianity, so Charlemagne left the north and went to invade the Muslim kingdoms in Spain. But almost immediately, the Saxons decide not to convert and send more raiding parties as far south as the Rhine. Charlemagne returns, pushes them back, and also begins sending missionaries, some of them brought over from England, to the Saxons, in another failed attempt to convince them to take up Christianity, join Charlemagne's alliance, become Catholic, and thereby become peaceful. Although there are some accounts of mass baptisms, sometimes forced. In 782, Charlemagne issued a new code of law that threatened severe and even capital punishment against anyone caught practicing Saxon paganism. This was seen as something of an outrage, although it's possible that it was also simply a justification for something the Saxons were going to do anyway, and it led to a new Saxon leader named Wittekund leading a serious revolt against Carolingian control. Charlemagne responded, according to some sources, by ordering the beheading of as many as 4,500 rebels. Like the Battle of Tours, the exact number may be an exaggeration, but the bloody event did occur in one fashion or another. He rounds up as many rebels as he can find and simply has them all executed. After further, almost genocidal repression of these revolts, the Saxons are splintered into groups, and only local groups really continue their rebellions. Some of them do convert, and the last rebellion actually comes in 804. Charlemagne again responds with fairly extreme measures, deporting almost the entire population of a couple of tribes into central France, where the pressure to culturally assimilate will be much, much higher, and he hands over all of their lands to the few loyal groups of Saxons that had helped him suppress that rebellion, who had already converted. He also destroys any trace of the location and objects of their previous pagan worship. Now, more than any single group at the edge of Frankish lands, the pagan Saxons received the most persistent clashes between pagans and Christians, independent smaller political units, and the consolidated and unified Frankish kingdom, and the Roman practices of law and bureaucratic culture against the customary practices of the Saxon tribes. So, to conclude, I'm going to review what I've gone over today, and start that review by way of one last side note about texts and writing. When Charlemagne sets up this kingdom, the consolidation takes a long time, right? His grandfather, Charles Martel, begins the process of setting up Frankish power. His father, Pepin, is the one who first gets his coronation directly from the Pope. And as Charlemagne is consolidating all of this new territory, especially in Saxony, he looks to Rome and to papal models for all sorts of things. Legitimacy, administrative practices, artistic production, even the music and liturgy of the church, as I mentioned. What we're looking at here is a coronation gospel from the early 9th century. It was possibly used for Charlemagne's own son, Louis, at his coronation. The writing and the style, although there's a little bit of stylized knotwork in the capital letters, these are distinctly Roman capitals. And the rest of the writing is a new style, basically designed by Charlemagne's scribes at his court to be clear and as easy to read and write as possible, in large part to facilitate the increasing levels of bureaucratic production throughout the empire. This writing style is actually the source of modern-day lowercase letters. This system is invented by Charlemagne's scribes as a quick and clear way to write. And this style of writing and the importance of new, clear written communication serves as a small example of how new laws were written, rescripts get sent around the empire, and communication becomes increasingly bureaucratic, all modeled after Roman systems. And this writing system, actually called Carolingian minuscule, right? Carolingian lowercase. If we put this image alongside the Venerable Bede from earlier, the difference is fairly clear, particularly in the large capitals. Compare those to the insular capitals that give this very strong Anglo Saxon influence, despite the presence of some Roman influence in England. That same Roman influence is much stronger in Charlemagne's kingdom. They see themselves, or Charlemagne at least sees himself, as a successor to the Roman emperors, and has the pretense of owning a large piece of territory that Rome held, obviously with a capital further north, but he also holds territories further north, like the lands in Saxony that Rome never achieved. With the appearance of Islam, there's not a sense that the southern rim of the Mediterranean is accessible anymore. So this does basically reformulate a kingdom with Roman pretenses, Christian faith, Catholic faith, and centralized state power. From Charles Martel to Charlemagne, this is a reformulation of centralized power, no longer directly looking to Roman imperial control for legitimization, but rather to the popes. They looked to the pope for religious and political validation, although with Charlemagne there was some tension already as to whether the pope is above the emperor/king or the king is above the pope. And we'll come back to that in future lectures. But these aspects, along with the northwestern center of power, become the model for most later European kings and emperors, as well as the legendary origins of European, so-called, as opposed to Roman culture. As I've said a couple of times, that's really what's key about these events. Charlemagne's legendary status becomes a touchstone for later kings. The emperors of Germany, like Frederick Barbarossa, the Habsburgs, like Charles V in Spain in the 16th century, who in fact fancies himself the next Charles the Great, right? Charlemagne himself is Charles I. Charles V of Spain thinks of himself as the next Charlemagne. Even today, groups use Charlemagne as the archetype of European culture. There's an early 20th century American textbook that describes so-called Western culture as a combination of, quote, the Greek philosopher, the Roman lawgiver, and the Teutonic lover of freedom, with Charlemagne's kingdom combining Germanic military might, Roman law, and resuscitating classical education and copying countless documents of both Roman and Greek philosophy. So he gets portrayed as the finest and one of the first examples of this combined culture. There's even a think tank started in 2018 that is called the Charlemagne Institute that purports to defend Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian values. And you'll notice the Teutonic has been toned down, in large part because of its earlier associations with German nationalism and Nazis. But they do explicitly claim Charlemagne's mantle, saying, quote, in 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Historians agree that that moment signaled the end of the Dark Age brought about by the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of an enlightened Judeo-Christian West. Now, historians don't really agree with that. As I think I've described, the situation is much more complex, and the institution of centralized power is not without its victims or its precursors. The methods used by the Carolingians look something like the methods of the Merovingians, and monasteries throughout Europe had already been copying texts, despite the fact that there is a resurgence of writing and new education, particularly under Charlemagne. As I will describe next time, this empire is also remarkably short-lived, based on some of the same forces that were in play centuries earlier. We will talk a little bit about Charlemagne's successor Louis, his son, and especially his grandsons. The kingdom eventually gets divided between multiple siblings and doesn't last long as major dynasties go. By 900, basically everything has come apart, and what public authority looks like and how authority is exercised goes through yet another shift and begins to look more like what is often referred to as the feudal system. Now, one of your readings is going to dispute the use of that term, and we will talk about the complexities of political control in an era of disintegrated public authority. So stay tuned for the next lecture. Thank you. This has been lecture number 1-3, The Northern Successors of Rome, in the Introduction to Medieval History class at Marlboro College. The theme music was generously written for me by Matan Rubinstein. If you liked this lecture, or any of the lectures on the series, please give it a like on YouTube so that others can find it, or leave a note in the comments. Editing and recording of the text was done by me. I'm Adam Franklin-Lyons, and thank you for listening.